One stormy night, a black man drove his old pickup truck home after a tiring shift at work. On the road, he suddenly came across a smoking luxury car next to which was an old man, soaked, cold, shivering helplessly in the storm. Without hesitation, he stopped to help the old man and took him to his house for the night. But the next morning, the old man had disappeared, leaving only a letter. Little did he know that, when the old man reappeared, his life would change forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our daily stories about kindness. The storm had been brewing since late afternoon, rolling across the Ohio sky like a slow, restless animal. Ethan Walker tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his old Chevy Silverado rattled along the empty two-lane road outside Riverton. The wipers struggled to keep up, slapping back and forth with a tired rhythm that matched the ache in Ethan's shoulders. His shift at Harbor Point Diner had run long again, and the combination of exhaustion and storm made his eyes sting a little. The heater blew weakly against the cold seeping through the truck's doors. He rolled his neck, trying to stay alert. There were nights when the loneliness pressed heavier than usual, and stormy nights always brought that reminder, the memory he tried hard not to replay. But the road demanded attention, not memories. Rain hammered the windshield so hard it was like driving through a sheet of moving glass. He eased off the gas, the truck fishtailing slightly before catching traction again. "Easy now," he murmured to the wheel, as if coaxing an old tired friend. Then something flickered ahead, orange lights, blinking weakly. Hazards. Ethan leaned forward, squinting through the rain. A car sat crooked along the right shoulder, a sleek shape half submerged in darkness. As he drew closer, the shape became clearer. A Lexus, expensive looking even under mud and rainwater, its hazard lights struggling to stay alive. And beside it stood a man. Tall, older, completely drenched. His gray hair stuck to his forehead, and his suit, what looked like a very expensive one, clung to his frame as if it weighed him down. He held a phone in his hand, tapping it helplessly, shaking it like he hoped the storm might suddenly decide to give him one bar of signal. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. Most people would keep driving. It was late, the storm was bad, and a stranger at the side of the road always carried some risk. But Ethan was not most people. He slowed the truck to a stop a dozen feet ahead, threw it into park, and reached over to yank the passenger door open. Rain poured in instantly, cold and sharp, hitting the seat and his arm. "You all right?" Ethan shouted over the storm, raising his voice just to cut through the roar of water and wind. "Sir, you need help?" The older man blinked against the downpour, momentarily stunned that anyone had actually stopped for him in weather like this. For a heartbeat he simply stared at Ethan, searching his face as if measuring whether he could trust him. Then with a small decisive nod, he hurried forward and climbed into the truck. The door slammed shut with a dull thud, and the storm's fury was muffled to a distant roar. The man exhaled shakily and brushed water from his sleeves. "My phone's dead," he said, breath still catching, "and the car, it just died on me." Ethan nodded and reached for the heater controls, turning the fan up until warm air began to fill the cab. "Happens out here. Service barely exists on a good day." He glanced at the man's soaked hands trembling lightly in his lap. "You sure you're okay? Need an ambulance?" No, the man said quickly, almost too quickly. "Just cold, wet, and stranded." Ethan put the truck back into gear and eased onto the road. "Well, you're not stranded anymore. Let's get you out of this mess." For a few long seconds, silence settled between them. Just the hum of the engine and the relentless hammering of rain on the roof. The older man, his breathing beginning to steady, studied Ethan's profile with a quiet, cautious curiosity. "You didn't have to stop," he said softly. "Most wouldn't." Ethan kept his eyes ahead. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." A pause stretched out like a held breath, filled with the rhythmic drumming of rain and the occasional groan of the truck's suspension as it hit potholes hidden beneath rising water. "What's your name?" the man asked at last. "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Walker." The man nodded once. Arthur Hale." Ethan offered a tired half-smile. "Nice to meet you, Arthur. Sorry it had to be on a night like this." Arthur let out a short, weary chuckle. "I suppose," he said, "there are worse nights to meet a stranger." Ethan didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on the ribbon of flooded road ahead. His heart had begun to pound harder, not with fear but with something deeper, something familiar. The ache began again, the quiet, tightening in his chest he'd never learned to shake. The storm outside seemed to grow heavier, or maybe it was just that memories always chose the worst moments to return. He heard the officer's voice again, 2 years old, but as sharp as the rain against the windshield. There were no witnesses, no one stopped, she was alone. Thunder cracked overhead, dragging him back to the present. He breathed deeply through his nose and kept driving. Arthur watched him now, noticing the tension in Ethan's jaw, the steadiness of his hands despite the uneven rhythm of his breath. "Forgive me for saying so," Arthur said gently, "but you look like someone who's driven through worse storms before." Ethan swallowed, his throat felt tight. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something like that." Neither spoke for a while. The world outside was nothing but dark fields, drowned fences, and sheets of rain sweeping across the road. No houses, no gas stations, no lights except Ethan's headlights carving out a small fragile pocket of visibility. Eventually Ethan exhaled through his nose. "You sure you don't have family nearby? Someone you could call once the storm lets up?" Arthur looked down at his useless phone. "No, no one nearby." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Well, even if we could get a hold of someone, the roadside assistance number's worthless out here after midnight. They won't send anyone till morning at best, and the nearest motel's a good 40 minutes past the main highway. No chance we're making it through the floodwater." Arthur absorbed this quietly, eyes flicking toward the rain-lashed windows. "I see. We'll figure something out," Ethan said, though his voice was softer now, more thoughtful. Arthur studied him again, really studied him. The exhaustion etched into Ethan's face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the weight he carried like a second skin. "You're a kind man," Arthur said quietly. Ethan didn't answer, his jaw shifted just slightly. After a long moment, he cleared his throat. "Look, my place isn't far. Back a few miles. It's nothing fancy, but it's dry and warm. You can stay the night. In the morning, once the roads clear a bit, I'll help you get a tow or a new battery or whatever you need." Arthur blinked, surprised, not distrustful, just taken aback by the generosity. Are you sure? I don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble," Ethan said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Storm like this, no one should be out in it. Least of all alone." Arthur's expression softened. Gratitude flickered through the tired lines of his face. "Thank you, Ethan." "Truly." Ethan only nodded, unable to trust his voice not to crack. So he kept driving, toward home, toward shelter, toward something he couldn't quite name, while the storm raged on outside and the ghosts of old memories pressed quietly at the edges of his thoughts. When they reached town, the rain was still falling in heavy sheets, the kind that made the streetlights hum and flicker. Most homes were dark. Riverton went to sleep early. Ethan turned down a narrow residential street. "Just need to make a stop first," he said. Arthur lifted a brow. "This late? I left my daughter with a neighbor while I worked. I need to bring her home." Arthur nodded, understanding softening his expression. Ethan parked in front of a small single-story home with a faded blue porch light. Rain bounced off the roof in loud splatters. He jogged to the front door, Arthur watching through the foggy truck window as Ethan knocked gently. The porch light brightened, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Cooper, an older woman in a worn pink robe. She blinked at the sight of Ethan standing there, dripping wet. "Oh dear," she whispered. "Come in out of the rain." "I'm all right," Ethan assured her, shaking his head. "Just here for Chloe. I'm really sorry it's so late." "Nonsense," she said kindly. "She fell asleep hours ago." A moment later, Ethan stepped back outside with Chloe sleeping heavily in his arms, her cheek resting on his shoulder. One small hand clutched the collar of his hoodie as if by instinct. The sight made something soften in Arthur's face, something old and unused. Ethan opened the truck door with one hand, somehow managing to keep Chloe steady. Rain blew in again, cold and sharp. He settled Chloe in the back seat, tucking his hoodie around her small frame. Arthur watched quietly, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, seeing the gentleness in Ethan's movements. "You're doing a good job," Arthur said softly. Ethan slid into the driver's seat again, brushing rain from his forehead. "Trying my best." The truck rolled toward Ethan's apartment building, an older brick complex with worn stair rails and a flickering security light. The parking lot was half flooded, puddles reflecting the glow of the street lamp. Inside, Ethan carried Chloe to her bedroom and tucked her beneath a faded quilt decorated with cartoon stars. She murmured something in her sleep, and he pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. Arthur waited in the living room, shifting awkwardly out of his wet shoes. He sat on the old couch, looking around at the apartment, a small place, clean and lived in, filled with soft evidence of a child's presence. Drawings taped to the fridge, a row of rainbow-colored markers on the coffee table, a tiny white sneaker lying beside the rug. Ethan returned with a towel and an old t-shirt that looked big enough for Arthur to use as sleepwear. Arthur accepted it with quiet gratitude. While Arthur changed, Ethan made tea and a simple bowl of instant soup. The kettle hissed softly, the apartment filled with the faint scent of chicken broth, steam curling lazily upward. When Arthur emerged from the bathroom, wearing Ethan's spare t-shirt and sweatpants, he looked different, less polished, more human. He sat at the small dining table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug Ethan placed in front of him. For a long moment, they simply sat in the quiet, listening to the storm soften outside. The refrigerator hummed. A pipe somewhere in the wall clicked. Chloe shifted softly in her sleep down the hall. Arthur cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Do you often bring strangers home in storms?" Ethan gave a tired smile. "No, you're the first." Arthur looked down at his tea, his voice lowering. "Why then?" Ethan hesitated. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, one of those tiny involuntary gestures a person does when wrestling between telling the truth and keeping it buried. Eventually he let out a slow breath. "My wife," he said quietly. "Her name was Maya." Arthur looked up, gentle and attentive. She died in a storm like this. 2 years ago." The room stilled. "I didn't know," Arthur said softly. Ethan nodded. Her car went off the road, skidded out near the curve past the grain silos. It was dark, and the rain was heavy. She was stuck there a long time before someone found her. His voice tightened. Nobody stopped. Arthur's eyes softened with a pain that wasn't quite his but felt close enough. Ethan continued, though his voice seemed to come from a deeper place now. "So when I see someone stranded in the rain, I stop. I can't not stop." Silence filled the small apartment, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. Arthur set his mug down with careful hands. "You've been through more than most men could bear. Yet you're still out here doing good for people." Ethan shrugged. "I'm just trying not to let the world make me someone I'm ashamed of." Arthur studied him, the tired eyes, the worn clothes, the child's artwork behind him, the little details that painted a fuller picture of the man sitting across the table. "You work at the diner down the road?" Arthur asked. "Harbor Point." "Yeah, been there a while." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "Pay's not great, but it's steady. Lets me keep a roof over Chloe's head." "And you raise her alone?" "Yeah." Ethan's smile softened. "She's a good kid. Bright. Loves drawing. Misses her mom more than she lets on." Another quiet moment passed. Outside, the rain slowed to a whisper. Arthur spoke again, his voice softer than before. "You've built a home here. A warm one." Ethan chuckled lightly. "It's small, but we make do." "You make more than do," Arthur said gently. "Oh, you've made something honest. Something full of love." Ethan didn't respond, but a hint of gratitude flickered in his eyes. The two men sat in peaceful silence for a while, before Ethan finally gestured toward the couch. "You can sleep there tonight. It's not fancy, but it's dry." Arthur nodded his thanks. Chloe's soft breathing drifted faintly through the hall. The storm eased to a light patter against the windows. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a trace of calm settle in the room. Arthur lay down on the couch, pulling one of Ethan's blankets over himself. He closed his eyes slowly, as though letting go of a long-held tension. Ethan dimmed the lights, whispered a quiet "good night," and disappeared into his room. Arthur opened his eyes for just a moment, and looked around the little living room, small, old, imperfect, and yet filled with something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth. Not from a heater or a blanket. From people. When Ethan woke the next morning, pale light filtered through the blinds. The storm had passed. The air was calm, the apartment still. He padded into the living room quietly, expecting to see Arthur asleep. But the couch was empty. The blanket was folded neatly at one end, like someone who had been raised with good manners had taken the time to tidy it. On the back of the couch lay a small piece of paper. Ethan picked it up. The handwriting was neat but slightly shaky, as if written by someone unused to expressing emotion. "Thank you for treating me like a human being." That was it. No signature. No explanation. No number. Ethan read it twice, then tucked it carefully into his wallet, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest, something soft, almost hopeful. He couldn't know yet that within 24 hours that handwritten note would be only the first sign that his life was about to change in ways he never expected. But as he stood there, holding the note, he felt a faint warmth spreading through him. Something gentle, something that whispered, "Kindness always finds a way back." By the time the sky over Riverton had turned a pale, tired gray, the streets were still damp from the night's storm. Puddles waited in the cracks of the parking lot outside Ethan's building, reflecting the weak morning light and the shape of his old Chevy Silverado. Inside the apartment, Chloe sat at the small kitchen table in her pajamas, legs swinging, her hair sticking up on one side. She coughed into her elbow, a small dry sound that made Ethan look over from the counter with a worried frown. "You sure you're up for school?" he asked, sliding a bowl of oatmeal toward her. "I'm okay," she said, her voice a little rough. "We have the art test today, remember? I drew lots of practice ones." She mimed a little scribble in the air and gave him a hopeful smile. He studied her face. Her cheeks were a touch pink, eyes slightly glassy, but she was alert. Determined. That stubborn set to her mouth was one he knew all too well. She had inherited that from her mother. "All right," he said gently, "but if you start feeling worse you tell your teacher. Deal?" She nodded, spoon already halfway to her mouth. "Deal." He checked the time on the microwave. If everything went smoothly, he could drop her at school and still get to the diner by the start of his shift. It would be tight, but doable. He grabbed his worn work jacket and her little backpack, trying not to think about the empty spot on his own left hand where a ring used to be. They headed down the stairs and out into the crisp air. The storm clouds had thinned, leaving behind a soft, cool morning. The Silverado waited like it always did, a little battered, a little tired, but still theirs. "Okay, old man," Ethan muttered to the truck as he settled Chloe inside and shut her door. "Just one more day, that's all I'm asking." He climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine clicked. He tried again. The same dry click, like a cough with no breath behind it. His stomach sank. "Come on." He pumped the gas once, twice, then turned the key again. The starter whined weakly for a second, then fell silent. The dashboard lights flickered and died. Behind him, Chloe leaned forward in her seat. "Daddy." "It's all right," he said quickly, even though his chest had started to tighten. He turned the key one more time, harder this time, as if willpower could flow through his fingers into the ignition. Nothing. The silence from the engine was louder than the storm had been. He exhaled slowly, jaw tightening. He checked the time again. Every minute felt like it was slipping through his fingers like water. "Okay," he said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Change of plans." He walked around, opened the passenger door, and lifted Chloe back out. "We're walking to Mrs. Cooper's. She'll drive you to school with her grandkids. I'll run the rest of the way." "Run?" Chloe repeated, eyes wide. He gave her a crooked smile. "Your dad's still got a little speed left. Don't worry." They hurried down the sidewalk together, his longer strides slowing so she could keep up. The air was cool and damp, and their shoes splashed through small puddles. As they reached Mrs. Cooper's house, he knocked quickly, shifting from foot to foot. The door opened, and Mrs. Cooper peered out, cardigan wrapped around her thin frame. "Morning, Ethan." "Oh dear, you look worried." "Truck won't start," he said, trying not to sound as panicked as he felt. "Could you take Chloe with you when you take the boys to school?" "Of course," she said at once, her voice warm. "Come here, sweetheart." Chloe hesitated, looking back up at her father. "Daddy, you're gonna be late." He knelt, resting his hands gently on her shoulders. "I might be a little late, yeah, but it's gonna be okay." Her small brow wrinkled. "Because you helped that man?" The question cut through him. Not cruelly, just honestly. He smiled softly. "Because I did what I knew was right, and now I'll do my best to fix everything else." "That's all we can ever do." She nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She hugged him tightly around the neck, her arms warm against his skin. "Go impress them with your drawings," he whispered. "I will," she said, then gave him one more quick squeeze before letting Mrs. Cooper lead her inside. As the door closed, Ethan turned toward town and started to run. The diner was almost a mile and a half away. Not so far in theory, but far enough when you were wearing old work shoes and trying not to think about the time ticking past. The chilled morning air burned in his lungs. His feet slapped the wet pavement, splashing up tiny bursts of water that dotted his pants. His mind raced faster than his feet. If I'm 10 minutes late, maybe Derek will just sigh and roll his eyes. If I'm 20 minutes late, he swallowed hard and pushed himself faster. His breath fogged in front of him, short and sharp. By the time the glowing sign of Harbor Point Diner came into view at the end of the street, his legs felt heavy. Sweat clung to the back of his neck despite the chill. His heart hammered in his chest, part from exertion, part from dread. He slowed to a walk just before reaching the entrance, trying to catch enough breath that he wouldn't stumble and panting like he'd run a marathon. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, straightened his jacket as best he could, and stepped inside. The bell over the door chimed. The smell of coffee and bacon hit him first, familiar and comforting. The sound hit next, silverware clinking, people talking, chairs scraping. Morning rush, and then Derek's voice cut through it all. "Well, look who decided to join us." The tone was sharp enough to slice through the room. Ethan went still for half a heartbeat, then forced himself to keep walking forward. He tried to nod in greeting, tried to make it look like he was just a few minutes late, nothing more. "Sorry," he said, breathing still a little uneven. "My truck." "Oh, let me guess," Derek said loudly, turning so everyone could hear. The heroic single dad had more important things to do than show up for work on time. Conversation at nearby tables softened to a murmur. A man in a plaid jacket looked over his shoulder. A woman nursing a coffee mug raised her eyebrows slightly. Ethan felt his ears grow hot. "I'm not making excuses," he said, keeping his voice level. "The truck wouldn't start. I ran here as fast as I could." Derek stepped closer, the shine on his shoes catching the diner's overhead lights. His black vest hugged his frame like armor. His smile was thin and cold. "You ran," he said, mock admiration in his voice. "Well, that explains the sweat." A couple of regulars looked away, uncomfortable. Emily stood by the coffee pot near the counter. Her hands tightened around the handle, knuckles whitening. Colt glanced out from the kitchen window, his mouth set in a firm line. "I can stay late to make up the time," Ethan offered quickly. "No breaks." "I'll break." Derek cut him off with an impatient wave. "You don't seem to understand, Ethan. This isn't about one morning. This is about image." "Image," Ethan repeated, thrown. "Yes," Derek said, taking a half step back so he could project his voice. "As in the image we present when the owner of this diner finally decides to show his face. That's happening today. Did you forget that?" "Of course you did." Ethan blinked. "I didn't know it was today." "Well, it is," Derek snapped, "and I can't have my staff dragging in late, looking like they just finished a half marathon through the sewer." The words landed like open-handed slaps. Ethan straightened. "I came in late because my truck died and I still had to make sure my daughter got to school. I ran here because I care about this job. I didn't stroll in for fun." "Oh, we all know you care," Derek said, sarcasm biting into each word. "You care so much about being some sort of hero, picking up strangers in storms, playing Good Samaritan. But when it comes to showing up when it matters, you fail." A tightness wrapped around Ethan's chest. Helping someone who was stranded in that storm wasn't a mistake. "Oh, I'm sure it felt noble," Derek said, walking around with that sad little backstory. "My wife died in a storm, so now I rescue every lost soul I see." He mimed quotation marks with his fingers. "Do you think that makes you special?" Emily sucked in a sharp breath. "Derek, enough," he snapped at her without breaking eye contact with Ethan. Ethan's fingers curled into fists at his sides. He felt that old familiar ache rising in his throat, pushing against his restraint. "You don't talk about my wife," he said quietly. Derek smirked. "Then don't keep using her as an excuse." The room seemed to tilt for a brief second. Plates being set down, coffee being poured, every noise faded into a dull buzz. Ethan's vision sharpened on Derek's face, on that smug expression that had never looked uglier. He took a slow breath. "All I'm asking," he said, voice steady but low, "is a chance to clock in and get to work. I'm 10 minutes late, not an hour. We both know I cover extra shifts. I stay late, I do what needs doing. And we both know," Derek shot back, "that first impressions matter more than loyalty. The owner is coming, and I'm not risking him walking in here and seeing." He gestured up and down at Ethan. This, Ethan repeated, hurt and disbelief colliding in his chest. "A sweaty, out-of-breath charity case who can't even keep his own life together," Derek said. "I need staff I can rely on, not a human sob story." For a heartbeat no one moved. Ethan felt like someone had kicked a chair out from under him. He swallowed. "You know that's not who I am." "I know what I see," Derek replied. "And what I see is a liability." He straightened his tie, the motion sharp. "You're done here, Ethan. You're fired. Effective right now." The word fired seemed to echo off the walls. Ethan's first instinct was to argue, to shout, to list every double shift he'd taken on, every time he'd covered for someone, every time he'd shown up early and stayed late without complaint. But the words stuck in his throat. He knew nothing he said now would change Derek's mind. Not in front of a room full of customers. The humiliation was already done. His shoulders sagged, just slightly. He felt eyes on him, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some simply curious. Emily took a careful step closer. "Derek, this isn't right. You can't just get back to work." Derek snapped without looking at her. Ethan looked at her, then at Colt in the kitchen. Both of them held his gaze for just a moment, apology in their eyes. He swallowed again, forcing down the lump in his throat. "Fine," he said quietly. "If that's how it is." He turned toward the door. With each step, he felt his world shrink a little, one more safe place closing off, one more piece of stability crumbling. He pushed open the door, the bell chimed weakly behind him. Out on the sidewalk, the cool air felt sharper now, stinging his cheeks like a second storm. He stepped onto the wet pavement, his reflection rippling in a puddle near the curb. And across the street, sitting in a parked SUV with its engine running low and steady, Arthur Hale watched him go, his expression darkening with every step Ethan took away from the diner. Arthur had come that morning to get a feel for the place. He had intended to slip in quietly, observe the staff, maybe have a cup of coffee and see if the diner still carried the heart it had when he bought it. He had not expected to watch the man who had taken him in from a storm be publicly stripped of dignity in front of a room full of strangers. He had seen enough. Arthur stepped onto the wet sidewalk, the faint smell of rain still clinging to the air. The street was quiet at this time of morning, only the hum of a vending truck approaching from the far end and the rustle of a light breeze passing through the maple trees lining the curb. He watched Ethan's figure shrink slowly down the block, shoulders hunched, jacket damp, the weight of humiliation still heavy on him. There was something about the way Ethan walked that made Arthur's chest tighten. Ethan wasn't just tired, he wasn't just angry. He looked defeated, like a door he had worked so hard to keep open had been slammed in his face. And Arthur knew the feeling too well. He turned toward the diner. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, its red glow reflected in the puddles along the sidewalk. Inside, he could see movement, customers shifting uneasily in their booths, waitresses walking silently, Derek pacing behind the counter with the jittery posture of someone trying to reassert control. Arthur's footsteps carried him to the door, slow but deliberate. He wasn't an imposing man by height or build, but there was a gravity to him, an old kind of authority, the type that didn't have to be shouted to be respected. He reached for the diner's handle and pushed it open. The bell chimed, heads turned. A few customers recognized him, though they couldn't quite place where from. Emily froze, nearly spilling the coffee she was refilling. Colt's head jerked up from the grill window. But Derek saw a well-dressed older man and immediately plastered on a smile, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who thought he owned the room. "Good morning," Derek called out, straightening his vest, smoothing his hair. "Welcome to Harbor Point Diner. Table for one." Arthur walked past him without answering, the soles of his shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum. For a moment, Derek stood blinking, thrown off balance. "Sir?" he tried again, voice strained. "Can I help you with?" Arthur turned around slowly. "Yes," Arthur said. "You can." The tone was calm, almost gentle, but it carried something firm beneath it, something that made Derek's smile falter. "You can explain," Arthur continued, "why you just fired the best man on your staff." Silence choked the diner. Derek blinked. "Once, twice." "Sir? I don't know what you mean. Arthur met his eyes without flinching. Yes, you do. Derek swallowed. The background chatter of customers dipped into an uncomfortable hush. Even the clatter of dishes seemed to soften, as if the diner itself was listening. Are you someone Ethan knows? Derek asked carefully, calculating how to spin the situation. Arthur shook his head lightly. No, not someone he knows. And then a beat later, but someone you should. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a slim leather card holder. He pulled free a simple white business card, his name printed neatly in black lettering, and set it on the counter in front of Derek. Derek's eyes widened. Arthur Hale, owner and principal partner. Hale Hospitality Group. The color drained from Derek's face. Oh, Derek breathed. I see. Arthur stepped a little closer, not threateningly, just close enough that the truth between them couldn't be ignored. You know why I came today? Arthur said softly, because I wanted to see what my restaurant is really like, its nature, its people, its values, and how it treats its servers. Derek's lips parted, but nothing came out. Arthur continued. I watched my employee walk into this diner this morning with worry etched all over his face. I watched him try to explain himself, and I watched you humiliate him in front of both staff and customers. Sir, if you'll just give me a moment to explain. No, Arthur said, not unkindly, you have done enough explaining for one day. Colt stepped forward from behind the counter, wiping his hands on a towel, giving a silent nod of encouragement, as if to say, keep going. Emily stood near the coffee station, her chest rising and falling quickly. Arthur turned to them. Emily, he said in a gentler tone, in your honest opinion, was Ethan a good employee? She nodded immediately, voice trembling with relief at being included. The best, sir. Everyone here knows it. Customers love him. He works harder than anyone. Arthur nodded, then looked to Colt. Colt didn't hesitate. Derek's got it out for him. Always has. Ethan's the guy keeping this place running when it's crazy. When the rest of us fall behind, he's the one picking up the slack. Arthur absorbed their words quietly, then he looked back at Derek. Derek tried to adjust his posture, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Sir, with all due respect, you don't know the whole story. I know enough, Arthur said simply. The air felt thick now, every person in the diner, holding their breath, waiting. Arthur took one small step forward. You will call Ethan Walker, he said, and you will ask him to return. Derek swallowed a second time. Now, Arthur repeated. Derek fumbled for his phone, fingers clumsy, his breath uneven. The phone rang once before Ethan answered. Ethan, Derek stammered. Can you come back please? There's been a misunderstanding. Arthur listened closely to Ethan's muffled voice on the line, a hesitant, why, followed by a short pause. Derek nodded, quick, frantic nods at nobody in particular. Yes, Derek said, I need you to come back. Immediately, another pause. Then Derek ended the call. Arthur looked at him. Good, two soft syllables that somehow carried finality. He turned then and chose a booth beside the window, sitting down with the slow grace of someone settling into a familiar place. He rested his hands on the table, then looked outside, waiting. It didn't take long. Through the glass, he saw Ethan's familiar figure approaching from down the sidewalk. Ethan's steps were hesitant, uncertain, as though he wasn't sure if this was a trick or another humiliation waiting for him. The bell chimed softly as he stepped back into the diner. His eyes found Arthur first, sitting calmly in the booth, a faint smile on his face. For a moment Ethan just stood there, still catching his breath from the walk back, still confused from the call he'd received. Arthur, he said quietly. Arthur rose from the booth. Good morning, Ethan, he said gently. Ethan blinked. He looked from Arthur to Derek, then back again. What's going on? Arthur stepped closer, his voice warm. I came to visit my diner today. Ethan stared. Your diner? Arthur gave a small nod. I own Harbor Point. Have for a year now. Ethan processed that with visible disbelief. You own this place? Yes, Arthur replied. And I wanted to see it with my own eyes. See the people who make it what it is. Ethan let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. I had no idea. I know, Arthur said. That was the point. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. And I saw something very important today. I saw injustice done to a man who offered kindness without hesitation. I saw someone punish you for being late, without bothering to understand why. Ethan swallowed, throat tight. You deserve better than that. Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. Arthur, I can't believe you're here. Arthur smiled softly. Believe it. He turned toward the staff, toward the customers watching with quiet anticipation. In front of everyone here, Arthur said, I would like to correct what was done this morning. He looked right at Ethan. You are rehired. Immediately, Ethan inhaled sharply. Arthur, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Arthur said, but there's more. He placed a light hand on Ethan's shoulder. I would like you to be co-manager. For a moment the diner fell into complete stillness. Emily gasped softly. Colt grinned wide. A customer in the corner booth muttered, well, I'll be. Ethan seemed frozen in place. Me? He whispered. You want me? Arthur nodded. You have integrity. You work hard. You treat everyone with respect. Those are the qualities that matter in a manager. Those are the qualities a community remembers. Emotion flickered in Ethan's eyes. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Arthur leaned in slightly. You showed kindness on a night when you had no reason to. And today kindness is showing itself to you. Ethan let out a shaky breath. I accept. Arthur smiled fully then, the kind of smile that came from deep, true satisfaction. He squeezed Ethan's shoulder once more. Good, then let's get to work. Behind them the diner slowly came back to life. Quiet conversation started up again. The clatter of silverware resumed, but in a lighter rhythm now, like the room itself felt different. Emily stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Congratulations, Ethan. Colt raised his spatula. Knew it. Ethan laughed softly, still overwhelmed, still trying to understand how the worst morning of his life had transformed so completely and so unexpectedly. Arthur watched him, seeing the shift happen in real time. The way Ethan stood straighter now, the way relief softened the tension in his shoulders, the way hope flickered back to life in his chest. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly present, like the first warm beam of sunlight after a storm. The weeks that followed felt like someone had gently, carefully started to rearrange the furniture in Ethan Walker's life. Nothing dramatic at first, nothing loud, just little changes that added up over time. The co-manager title that Arthur had given him came with a new name tag and a key to the office, but it also came with something heavier: responsibility. Real responsibility. The kind that lived in stacks of invoices and numbers on spreadsheets, not just in how fast you could carry plates to a table. Ethan still ran food and poured coffee when the floor got busy. He still greeted regulars with familiar smiles and checked on the older gentleman who always asked for his hash browns, crispy but not too crispy. But now, in the quieter hours after the breakfast rush and before lunch picked up, he found himself in the small office at the back of the diner, looking over things he never used to see. Schedules, vendor bills, weekly sales reports, a cash ledger that looked like it hadn't been carefully read in a long time. At first he felt like a kid sitting at a grown-up's desk. The office chair squeaked when he leaned back. The overhead light buzzed faintly. The computer took its time waking up, as if it too was suspicious of the change. One Tuesday afternoon, he sat there with a printout of the last 3 months' supply orders spread in front of him. The papers smelled faintly of toner and old coffee, the official scent of any small business. He traced a finger down the columns of numbers, lips moving silently as he added certain lines again in his head. Flour, eggs, bacon, coffee, cleaning supplies, the usual. But something gnawed at him. The totals did not match the rhythm of his memory. Breakfast crowds had been fairly steady. They weren't throwing away more food, yet the numbers said they were ordering more product than usual for the last few months. A lot more. He pulled a previous quarter's report from the filing cabinet and set the pages side by side. The difference stood out once he lined them up. Certain items spiked without any obvious reason. Cash deposits on certain days seemed thin. He frowned, the little crease between his brows deepening. Maybe I'm misreading, he thought. Maybe I'm just new at this, but the feeling stayed. He flipped to another sheet, ones that recorded cash versus card breakdowns. On several nights the credit card totals looked right. The dining room had been busy, tips had been decent, yet the cash amount was smaller than it should be. He tapped the paper with the back of his pen. Something wrong? Colt asked, leaning into the office doorway, one hand still holding a clean dish towel. Ethan looked up. Maybe, I'm not sure. Colt stepped in, glancing over his shoulder at the numbers. I never liked this part, he admitted. Numbers and I have an understanding. I cook. They leave me alone. Ethan managed a small smile, then fell quiet again, eyes drifting back to the sheets. You ever notice, he asked slowly, that we've been ordering more supplies even though we're not exactly busier than before? Colt rubbed his chin. Now that you mention it, the deliveries have looked heavier. I thought it was just my imagination. And some nights, Ethan added, we close out with less cash in the drawer than I'd expect. Not by a huge amount, just enough to nag at you. Colt's face sobered. You thinking someone's skimming? The word sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. I don't want to accuse anyone, Ethan said. But, something's off. Has been for a while if these reports are right. Colt nodded slowly, chewing on that. You want me to keep an eye out, see if I notice anything funny? Yeah, Ethan said quietly, but discreetly. No reason to start a panic. He closed the folders, but the questions remained open in his mind. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, staring at the dark outline of the ceiling fan above his bed. Beside him, on the nightstand, the little handwritten note Arthur had left that first morning sat under his phone, edges slightly curled now from wear. Thank you for treating me like a human being. He read it again in his head. Then he thought of the staff, the customers, the smell of bacon in the morning, and the clack of coffee cups on saucers. Harbor Point was more than a job now. It was a trust. If someone was stealing from this place, it wasn't just numbers being lost, it was trust. And that Ethan couldn't ignore. A few weeks later, the nagging turned into something more concrete. It was a Thursday, the kind of quiet weekday night where the last customers lingered over coffee refills and pie slices they didn't really need. The neon sign outside hummed in that familiar tired way, casting a soft pink-red glow onto the faded parking lines. Closing time came and went, and the last table finally stood, shrugged on their coats, and stepped out into the cool air, the bell over the door chiming one last time. Derek had offered, somewhat stiffly, to finish the closing routine. I'll count down the drawer, he'd said. You've had a long day, Ethan, go home. But something in his tone made Ethan hesitate. He didn't say no, he just said, I'll stay and do inventory in the back. 2 people make it go faster. Derek's jaw tightened just a fraction, but he forced a smile. Suit yourself. In the end, they worked in different parts of the diner. Derek at the front counter, counting the cash. Ethan in the storage area, checking boxes and taking quick notes. When he finished, he came out to the office where the nightly deposit forms were kept. The cash drawer sat in front of him, already closed. Derek was nowhere to be seen. Probably in the restroom, Ethan thought. He opened the drawer to enter the final totals. His eyes narrowed. He counted the money once. Then again. It was short, not by a huge amount, but by enough to matter. $150 were missing. He checked the deposit slip Derek had started filling out. It matched what was in the drawer, which meant either the money had never made it into the drawer, or it had been there and walked away. His heart thumped a little harder. He stood alone in the small office, the overhead light buzzing faintly. His hand rested on the edge of the counter, fingers drumming a slow, tense rhythm. When Derek came back from the restroom, Ethan kept his voice even. Drawers light. Derek glanced at the cash casually. Sometimes it happens. Bad tipping night. Tips don't go in the drawer, Ethan said. You know that. Derek shrugged. Then maybe folks paid more by card. It happens. Ethan held his gaze for a moment longer, but Derek's expression didn't change. It was smooth. A little too smooth. We'll make it up tomorrow, Derek added, turning toward the door. You heading out? In a minute, Ethan said. After Derek left, Ethan stood in the doorway of the empty dining room, staring at the register, the camera above, the space where customers had just been. He looked up at the small dome of the security camera mounted near the ceiling. The thought came slowly at first, then fully formed. Check the footage. He waited until he heard the distant sound of Derek's car peel out of the lot. Then he walked back into the office, turned on the computer connected to the security system, and queued up the feed from the last hour. At first, all he saw were familiar motions: Emily wiping down tables, Colt sweeping back by the kitchen, Derek moving around the counter. He fast-forwarded a little, then let the footage play. Derek's figure moved into the frame near the register. He glanced around. No customers, no staff. He opened the drawer. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding, breath shallow. There it was. Derek counted a stack of bills, slipped a portion into his pocket with a swift, practiced movement, then calmly began filling out the deposit slip with a reduced amount. Ethan felt his stomach drop.
He didn't move for several seconds, just watched the same 30 seconds of footage again, and again, and again. Any lingering doubt he might have had dissolved. It wasn't an error. It wasn't confusion. It was theft. From the diner. From Arthur. From all of them. He sat back in the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. Anger, disappointment, and a hollow sort of sadness washed through him in waves. He had suspected something was wrong, but seeing it with his own eyes made it real in a way that hurt. He thought about the nights he'd stayed late, the double shifts, the times he'd worried whether there'd be enough to cover payroll, all while someone was quietly pulling money out of the drawer. For a moment he considered marching straight out to the parking lot, calling Derek, confronting him, demanding answers. But then he remembered Chloe, and the life he was building now, not with rage, but with care. He thought of Arthur, of the trust between them. He picked up his phone. Arthur answered on the second ring. "Ethan," he said, sounding pleasantly surprised. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I think we have a problem." He explained what he'd found. First the strange supply orders, then the light deposits, and finally the footage he just watched. As he spoke, the words came steadier, but the pain under them didn't fade. When he finished, there was a quiet pause on the other end of the line. "I see," Arthur said at last, his voice lower now. The disappointment in it wasn't directed at Ethan. It sounded more like the way a good father spoke when he discovered someone had hurt his family. "Do you have the footage?" he asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "I saved it. I can show you." "This is not something we take lightly," Arthur said. "And it's not something we rush into either. We'll handle it correctly. I'll send someone to take a closer look, someone I trust." "Okay," Ethan replied. "What should I do in the meantime?" "Keep doing your job," Arthur said. "Keep your eyes open. Don't let on that you've seen anything. Let us build the full picture first." Ethan nodded, even though Arthur couldn't see him. "Understood." "And Ethan," Arthur added, "yeah, you did the right thing by telling me." Those words landed like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. After the call, Ethan shut down the monitor, turned off the office light, and stepped out into the cool night. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet, then climbed into his old truck and headed home to his sleeping daughter. 2 days later, a man walked into Harbor Point Diner, who looked at first glance like any other customer. He wore a simple denim jacket over a faded t-shirt, jeans and boots that looked like they'd seen plenty of miles. His face carried a few lines around the eyes, but his step was easy, and his smile casual. He took a seat at the counter, and ordered coffee and a stack of pancakes. Emily served him, chatting lightly. He smiled back, polite, unremarkable. It was only when the man finished his meal, and asked quietly, "Is Ethan around?" that Emily's brows lifted a little.
"Yeah," she said slowly. "He's in the back." "Want me to get him?" "Please," the man replied. "Tell him Nolan's here." Emily relayed the message into the office. Ethan came out a minute later, wiping his hands on a towel. The stranger stood, offering a handshake. "Ethan Walker." "Yeah," Ethan said, studying him. "That's me, Nolan Pierce," the man said. "Arthur sent me." His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp but friendly. There was a certain alertness about him, like someone who noticed more than he said. They stepped into the back office together, leaving the noise of the diner floor behind. "Private investigator?" Ethan asked once the door was shut. "That's the professional term," Nolan said with a faint grin. "I prefer man who pokes his nose in places it's paid to go." Despite himself, Ethan smiled a little. Nolan set a small notebook on the desk. "Arthur told me you've seen discrepancies, cash missing, funny numbers. You suspect someone specific." Ethan nodded. "I saw Derek take money from the drawer on camera." "Good," Nolan said. "Well, not good, but good that you have something solid. That's a start. But one video isn't enough if this goes legal. We need a pattern. We need dates, amounts, repetition. That's where I come in." "How are you going to do that?" Ethan asked. Nolan shrugged lightly. "Same way thieves work, quietly, repeatedly." Over the next couple of days, Nolan settled into the background of the diner's rhythm. He came in at different times, always under the guise of just being a regular customer. Sometimes he sat at the counter, sometimes in a booth. He ordered reasonable meals, paid in cash, tipped fairly, and he watched who handled the drawer, who stayed late, who logged the numbers at the end of the night. He marked down times, shifts, totals he could glimpse when someone didn't shield the paperwork completely from view. Ethan did his best to act normal. He kept greeting customers, he checked on tables, he made sure Emily and Colt were supported. All the while the knowledge of what Nolan was doing simmered quietly in the back of his mind. On the second evening, just before closing, Nolan caught Ethan's eye from a booth near the back and gave the smallest nod toward the office. Later, when the doors were locked and the chairs were flipped up onto tables, they met again in the back room. "I've seen enough to bother me," Nolan said, laying a small flash drive and some handwritten notes on the desk. "There are at least 3 more nights where the cash is coming up short, and on each of those nights your manager is the one closing alone. Security footage backs that up." Ethan felt that weight settle a little heavier, but it was the sort of weight that had a purpose now. "How much?" he asked quietly. Nolan flipped through his notes. "Hard count is a little over $3,000 over the last few months. Could be more before that. This is just what I can prove with what's on record now." Ethan let out a slow breath. "That's a lot of pancakes," he said, trying for a touch of humor and missing by a little. Nolan's gaze was direct. "It's theft, clear as day, from the business, from the staff, from Arthur, and from you, because money like that affects raises, repairs, everything down the line." "I know," Ethan said, "it just hits different seeing it written down." He brushed a thumb over the edge of the paper. His mind drifted back to late nights, busted coffee machines, talk of tight margins making everyone tense, all while someone had been quietly helping himself from the drawer. "What happens now?" Ethan asked. "Now," Nolan said, "Arthur decides how he wants to handle it. But if I were a betting man, I'd say he's going to want this addressed head on, in the open, no hiding it under the rug." Ethan nodded. "That sounds like him." Arthur arrived at the diner early the next morning. They met in the office, the door closed, the dull hum of the refrigerator and distant sizzle from the grill their background soundtrack. Nolan presented the evidence in an organized, steady way: dates, amounts, matching footage, recorded inconsistencies in the books. He spoke plainly, without drama, letting the facts speak for themselves. Arthur listened without interrupting, his face gradually settling into an expression of deep disappointment. Not the kind that flared into anger, but the heavy kind, the kind that carved quiet lines around his eyes. When Nolan finished, Arthur glanced at Ethan. "And you're sure," he asked, "that nobody else could have done this?" Ethan answered honestly, "From what I've seen, from who had access and when, I don't see how it could be anyone else. The missing amounts line up with the nights Derek closed alone." Arthur nodded slowly. There was a long silence. Finally Arthur folded his hands in front of him. "I built my career in businesses where everyone told me numbers mattered more than people," he said quietly. "I believed them for a long time. I stepped over people to chase profits, and somewhere along the way I stopped seeing the faces behind the folders." He looked up at Ethan. "I'm not going back to that. Not here." Ethan held his gaze. "So what do? We tell the truth," Arthur said, "in front of everyone." Nolan leaned back in his chair. "I told you he'd say that," he murmured with a small smile. They agreed on Monday morning, right before the start of the new week. Staff would be called in early, Nolan would be present, the police would be notified ahead of time, ready if needed. As the plan formed, Ethan felt 2 feelings grow at once inside him. One was relief, that the wrong he'd seen was going to be dealt with. The other was dread at the confrontation that was coming, at the tension it would place on the people he worked with every day. That night, when he walked through his apartment door, the familiar smell of spaghetti and jarred sauce greeted him. Chloe stood at the small dining table, her crayons spread out in a little explosion of color around her newest drawing. She looked up and beamed. "Daddy, look, I drew the diner." He walked over and leaned down to see. Sure enough, there it was, Harbor Point, with its big front windows and glowing sign, drawn in careful lines of brown and red and yellow. There were tiny figures inside, stick people with happy faces. "That's you," she said, tapping a little figure behind the counter. "And that's Miss Emily, and that's the man who always wears the hat." He smiled, heart aching a little at the innocence of it. "You did a good job. Do you like it?" she asked. "I love it," he said. She looked at him more closely then, head tilted. "You're doing your serious face." "My serious face," he repeated, amused. "Yeah," she said, mimicking his furrowed brow in an exaggerated way, "like when you're thinking big thoughts." He chuckled softly. "Maybe I am." She studied him a moment longer. "Is something wrong at work?" "Kids always knew more than you thought." He hesitated. He didn't want to weigh her down with adult worries, but he also knew he didn't have to tell her everything to be honest. There's something I have to do, he said carefully. Something hard, but it's the right thing. She nodded as if that made perfect sense. Like when you help the man in the rain. Sort of, he said. This time it's more about telling the truth, even when it might make people upset. Chloe twirled a crayon between her fingers. Mommy used to say that. Ethan's heart clenched gently. She did. Chloe nodded. She said good people do hard things, and sometimes it makes other people mad, but it makes your heart less heavy. He swallowed, blinking back a sting in his eyes. Yeah, he murmured, she did say that. He sat down at the table beside his daughter, letting the familiarity of crayons and paper and soft little voices anchor him. Later, when he tucked Chloe into bed, she caught his hand before he could turn away. Daddy, she whispered. Yeah, you're a good person. The words landed with a surprising force. He brushed some hair from her forehead. Thank you, Peanut. Don't be scared, she said, in that simple, clear way children sometimes have. You always tell me that. He managed a small laugh. You're right, I do. As he turned off the light and closed her door partway, he thought about what she'd said. Good people do hard things. The phrase echoed in his mind like a quiet drumbeat. He lay awake that night, staring at the faint pattern of streetlight filtering through the blinds, thinking about Monday morning. About the faces of the staff when they'd hear. About Derek's expression when confronted. About the feeling of finally pulling the problem into the light. He thought of the man he had once been, before Maya's accident, before late-night storms and lonely hospital hallways and single-father grocery runs. He thought of the promise he'd made to himself then, standing by a grave with frozen hands and a shattered heart, that he would try desperately to be a man his daughter could be proud of. A man Maya would recognize, the kind who stopped for strangers in storms. The kind who told the truth even when it cost him. He closed his eyes and let that promise settle inside him again, steady and solid. Outside, the town slept. Inside, Ethan waited, and Monday came with a brittle kind of cold that settled along the streets like a thin layer of frost. The sun had barely risen when Ethan pulled into the parking lot of Harbor Point Diner. His old truck creaked as he climbed out, the hood still bearing dried streaks from last night's dew. Arthur's car was already there, and beside it a second vehicle he recognized from the day Nolan arrived, the car belonging to the private investigator. A third vehicle sat farther back in the lot, engine running quietly, two officers inside sipping coffee from paper cups, waiting for a signal. The diner looked strangely still. The neon sign hadn't been turned on yet. He walked toward the front door with a pace that felt both heavy and steady. His stomach tightened with every step. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something deeper, a mix of duty and the edge of sadness that comes when something must end before it can heal. When he entered, the bell chimed softly. Arthur was standing near the counter, hands folded in front of him, posture straight but not rigid. He gave Ethan a calm nod of acknowledgement. Good morning, Arthur said. Morning, Ethan replied quietly. Nolan leaned against the far wall, notebook in one hand, expression neutral and professional. Emily hovered nearby, wringing her fingers in her apron. Colt stood behind the counter, spatula in hand like he didn't know where else to put it. Derek hadn't arrived yet. The silence was thick enough to feel. Arthur gestured for Ethan to come closer. Everything ready, Ethan nodded. The staff's here. I told them it was an early team meeting. Arthur gave a soft smile. In a way it is. Within a few minutes the front door swung open with the familiar jingle of the bell. Derek stepped inside, straightening his coat and smoothing his hair. He looked surprised to see everyone gathered so early, but not worried. More like someone walking into a room where he expected to have the upper hand. What's going on? Derek asked, forcing a small laugh. Staff meeting. Didn't know we were doing those at dawn now. No one laughed. Arthur stepped forward. Morning, Derek. Derek blinked, thrown off. Mr. Hale, I didn't expect you this early. I know, Arthur said, his voice steady. There are a few things we need to discuss. Derek looked around, noticing the expressions, Emily's nervousness, Colt's clenched jaw, Nolan's watchful stare. He shifted his weight. His smile faltered, then returned more tightly. Is there a problem? Arthur took a single step closer, the space between them shrinking. Yes, Derek, he said quietly. There is.
The pause that followed was long enough that the hum of the refrigerator felt louder than usual. Arthur continued, over the past several months there have been discrepancies in supply orders, deposit totals and cash drawer counts. Derek chuckled lightly. Sir, if this is about the occasional short night, Arthur held up a hand. Please don't lie, Arthur said. It wasn't harsh, it was almost gentle, and somehow that made it cut deeper. Derek froze. Nolan stepped forward, pulling a small flash drive from his pocket and setting it on a nearby table. We have footage, he said simply. And dates, and totals. Derek's breath hitched, just slightly. Footage of what? Arthur met his eyes steadily. Footage of you taking cash from the drawer. 8 times in the last 3 months, possibly more before that. Emily let out a quiet gasp. Colt muttered something under his breath. Derek blinked rapidly. No, that's not. There must be some mistake. Derek, Arthur said, voice soft, we have you on camera. Color drained from Derek's cheeks. Look, Derek said quickly, hands raising in a small panic gesture, we can talk about this. I've had a rough few months, personal issues. I needed the money but I was going to pay it back. I swear, even if that were true, Arthur said. You didn't come to me, you didn't come to Ethan, you didn't ask for help, you chose to steal. Derek shook his head. It's not like that. You don't understand. Nolan crossed his arms. I understand perfectly. Arthur gestured toward the door. Derek, the police are waiting outside, they'll want to speak with you. Derek's eyes widened, a mix of fear and disbelief. You're calling the police? You'd really do that to me? You did this to yourself, Arthur said quietly. Derek's gaze darted around the room, desperate now. Ethan, he pleaded suddenly, eyes locking on him. Come on, you're a father, you know what it's like to struggle. Tell him not to do this. Ethan's stomach twisted. For a moment it almost looked like Derek might cry. But he remembered Chloe's words the night before. Good people do hard things. Ethan swallowed. Derek, he said gently, I tried to give you the benefit of the doubt, but you kept taking. And you hurt this place, you hurt people who trusted you. Derek's shoulders sank. In the window the reflection showed the slow approach of 2 officers. Derek's voice cracked. Please, Arthur stepped back, giving the officers room as they entered through the front door. Their footsteps were soft but firm on the linoleum floor. Derek Monroe, one officer asked. Derek didn't answer, he just nodded weakly. You're under arrest for theft and falsifying financial records. The officer took Derek's wrist gently, not violent, just procedural, and began cuffing him. The metal clicked softly, an oddly small sound for such a big moment. Emily turned away, tears in her eyes. Colt stared at the floor. Nolan stood quietly, respectful of the gravity. Ethan watched with a heavy heart. Not triumphant. Not pleased. Just sad that this was where things had led. As the officers led Derek out, he looked back once, eyes full of accusation and something like despair. You think you're better than me, he snapped at Ethan. But you're just lucky. Without Arthur you're nothing. Ethan held his ground, his voice was steady. I don't need power, he said softly. I just need to be decent. Derek turned away, jaw clenched and disappeared into the morning light. The door shut softly behind him. Silence filled the diner again, deep and fragile. Arthur exhaled slowly. Thank you all for being here, he said. This wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He turned to Ethan, a small proud smile forming. You handled this with more grace than most people ever could. Ethan nodded, though emotion tightened his chest. Just trying to do the right thing, and that's why I chose you, Arthur said, to lead this place with me. 6 months later, Harbor Point Diner looked different. The same in many ways, the same premises, the same counter stools, the same laminated menus, but different in the ways that mattered. The paint was fresher, the ceiling fans worked smoothly now. A new sign glowed above the entrance, Harbor Point Diner, where kindness is served. The grand reopening had been modest, just like the diner itself. But steady word of mouth and genuine hospitality had brought new faces, new regulars, new energy. Business grew, slowly at first then steadily, until revenue was up nearly 40%. Ethan stood behind the counter, now dressed in a crisp shirt with the tag. Ethan Walker, co-manager Chloe, sat in a corner booth, working on her homework before Mrs. Cooper picked her up. She swung her legs back and forth while humming softly. Arthur sat in his usual booth with a cup of tea, reading the newspaper. His hair had grown a little longer since that stormy night. He looked a touch younger now. Not in age but in spirit. "Order up," Colt called from the kitchen window, sliding a plate onto the counter. "Got it," Ethan said, grabbing the plate and delivering it to a table of travelers who smiled warmly at him. Emily passed by with a tray, bumping Ethan's elbow playfully. "Boss man," she said with a grin. "Co-boss," he corrected, laughing. The diner hummed with the comfortable chatter of a place that knew its purpose. That night, after closing, Ethan drove home in the cool spring air. Chloe sat in the back seat, humming a tune from school, her drawings tucked safely into her backpack. As they reached their street, the sky darkened with the promise of rain. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle beginning to fall. The street lights shimmered in the wet pavement, throwing golden reflections that danced under the truck's headlights. Halfway home, Ethan slowed. A car sat pulled off to the side, hazard lights blinking faintly. The hood was open. An elderly man stood next to it, holding a flashlight with a shaky hand. His jacket was thin, his shoulders hunched against the damp. Chloe leaned forward. "Daddy, he looks cold." Ethan pulled over. The same way he had done months ago when he saw Arthur stranded in the storm. He turned off the engine and glanced back at Chloe. "Stay in the truck, okay? I'll go check on him." She nodded, trusting him completely. Ethan stepped out into the light drizzle, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The air smelled of wet asphalt and early spring blossoms. The old man turned toward him, startled. "Evening," Ethan said gently. "Car trouble?" "Oh yes," the man replied, voice trembling slightly. "I think the battery's dead. I was on my way to my daughter's. I shouldn't have taken the back road." "That's all right," Ethan said. "You're safe now. Let's take a look." The old man's shoulders eased, the relief visible even in the low light. Ethan worked quietly, carefully, checking the cables, making sure nothing was damaged. The man apologized twice for being a burden. Ethan shook his head. "You're not a burden," he said softly. "Everyone needs help sometimes." As he spoke the words, he remembered himself standing on a rainy night. A stranger shivering in the dark. A kindness returned in ways he never could have predicted. Within minutes, he had the battery reconnected enough to start the engine. The car sputtered, then roared back alive. The old man let out a breath of gratitude. Thank you, young man. You didn't have to stop." Ethan smiled, the same warm smile he'd given Arthur once. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, "I did." When he climbed back into his truck and drove the rest of the way home, Chloe looked at him with shining eyes. "You helped him," she said proudly. Ethan reached back and squeezed her small hand. "That's what we do," he said. "That's who we are." The rain continued gently outside, tapping softly on the roof like a whispered reminder. Kindness isn't weakness, it's strength in its purest form, and the circle kept going. And Ethan kept living it, every day, every storm, every quiet, ordinary moment in between. Spring came gradually to Riverton, the way seasons often do in places where life moves at a slower, more thoughtful pace. The town felt new in a subtle way, as if the winter had taken with it a few old burdens. Harbor Point Diner settled into this new season like a bird returning to familiar branches. The breakfast rush grew a little larger each week. Folks from neighboring towns started stopping by, having heard about a small diner with big heart. Some came because of the food. Others came because kindness had become something like the signature dish. On a warm Saturday morning, Ethan arrived earlier than usual. He walked through the empty lot with a quiet sense of ownership, pride and responsibility. The kind that felt earned, not given. He unlocked the front door, the metal key sliding smoothly into place. The bell chimed softly as he entered, echoing through the empty dining room. The booths were lined neatly. Fresh flowers sat in small mason jars along the windowsills. The sunlight slipping through the glass gave everything a soft golden hue. He loved the diner most at this hour, before the day began, when it felt like the world was offering him a clean page. He flicked on the overhead lights, turned on the coffee machine, and opened the blinds. The smell of freshly ground beans drifted into the air. A soft knock sounded at the door. Ethan turned to see Mrs. Langley, a widow in her 80s who walked the same route every morning for exercise. She smiled through the glass, tapping twice in greeting. He unlocked the door. "You're early today," she said. "So are you," he teased gently. "Well," she said, patting his arm as she shuffled inside, "I like starting my day someplace warm, and not just warm from the coffee." She settled into her favorite booth. Ethan poured her a cup without asking. She liked it with 1 sugar and a splash of cream, never more, never less. "You know," Mrs. Langley said, stirring her cup, "I've lived in this town 63 years. Seen it change in all kinds of ways. Some good, some not so good. But this diner," she paused, letting out a slow breath. "It feels like the old days again, when people cared." Ethan smiled softly. "That means a lot." "It should," she replied. "You've done something special here." He opened his mouth to deflect the compliment habit, but stopped. Instead he accepted the words with quiet humility. "You hungry?" he asked. "Always," she said, grinning. He brought her a small plate of toast and fruit. As he turned back toward the counter, he saw Arthur Hale enter through the front door. The older man paused for a moment, taking in the scene, the sunlight, the calm, the warmth of the place he helped rebuild. "Morning, Ethan," Arthur said, removing his hat. "Morning," Ethan replied. "You're early too." Seemed like the kind of day that deserved an early start. He walked to his usual booth and sat down with a quiet ease. He gazed out the window, watching a pair of robins hop along the sidewalk. "I've been thinking," Arthur began, voice low, "about storms. About nights when you feel small. About the people who stop for you when they didn't have to." Ethan paused. "That night changed things for both of us, didn't it?" "It did," Arthur folded his hands. "And it keeps changing things. That's the part people forget. One act of kindness doesn't just save a moment, it sets off a chain, it moves forward. It keeps growing." Ethan nodded, letting the truth of that settle. "And this diner," Arthur continued, "is proof of that chain. People feel different when they walk in now. I feel different. You did a lot to make that happen." Ethan said. Arthur shook his head gently. "I may have funded a remodel, but you remodeled the spirit of this place." The words struck Ethan in a way he wasn't prepared for. His throat tightened. "We're all doing it," he said quietly. "Every day, a little at a time." Arthur smiled. "Yes, and that's how communities heal." A few moments later, the morning staff arrived, Emily with her hair tied up and humming under her breath, Colt carrying his favorite spatula like a lucky charm. They waved to Ethan and Arthur as they slipped into their routines. The diner filled slowly. A young father came in with 2 toddlers, both holding stuffed animals. A group of high schoolers slid into a booth, dropping backpacks and physics textbooks onto the table. A pair of retired men took their usual corner seats, bickering lovingly about baseball statistics. The place buzzed, not loud, not chaotic, but alive. Chloe arrived, with Mrs. Cooper a bit later, proudly carrying a folder of new artwork. She ran to Ethan, hugging him around the waist. "Daddy, I drew you something." He knelt beside her and opened the folder. Inside was a crayon picture of the diner. Bright colors, smiling faces, a rainbow stretching across the roof, but what caught his breath was a detail he hadn't expected. She had drawn 2 figures under the rainbow, one tall, one small, him and her. And just behind them, slightly faded but drawn with care, a 3rd figure, Maya, smiling gently. Ethan swallowed hard. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered. Chloe beamed. "That's us. And Mommy watching over." He hugged her tightly, inhaling the soft scent of her shampoo. For a moment the world blurred around him, and the sound of the diner faded to a warm hum. "Can we hang it on the wall?" she asked. "Of course," he said, voice thick with emotion. They hung the drawing near the front counter, just above the spot where customers paid their bills. People paused to admire it as they passed. "That your girl's work?" one man asked with a grin. "Yep," Ethan said proudly. "She's got talent. She gets it from her mom," Ethan replied, smiling softly. Later that afternoon, when business slowed, Ethan stepped outside to breathe in the mild spring air. He leaned against the brick wall, folding his arms loosely and letting the sun warm his face. Arthur joined him. A moment later, You've built a good life here, Ethan. Arthur said. Ethan nodded. Still working on it, as we all are, Arthur replied. They stood side by side in companionable silence. A breeze rustled through the nearby trees, cars passed slowly on the street. Somewhere down the block, a church bell chimed the hour. After a while, Arthur said, "You know, kindness leaves a mark. Not just on the person who receives it, but on the person who gives it." Ethan turned toward him. "I think I'm finally starting to understand that." "You've done more than understand it," Arthur said. "You've lived it." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Arthur clapped him gently on the shoulder and headed back inside, leaving Ethan alone with the soft afternoon light. A minute later, Chloe opened the door. "Daddy, come back in. Someone wants more syrup." He chuckled. "All right, I'm coming." He followed her inside, the bell chiming again behind him, bright, friendly, hopeful. He looked around at the diner, the tables filled with neighbors, the laughter, the aroma of fresh coffee, the picture his daughter drew hanging proudly near the counter. This was home, not perfect, not easy, but filled with quiet miracles. Kindness had led him here, and kindness would carry him forward. As he walked back to the counter, the sunlight caught in the window, casting a gentle glow across his face. It was a simple moment, ordinary, humble, but filled with the peace of a life rebuilt. A life chosen, a life earned, and the story closed on that warm, steady light, soft as memory, bright as hope, lasting as kindness itself.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.